Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started in just about 2 minutes time. I hope to be on time. All right, everyone, it looks like it's about 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. So we're going to get started. Okay. Hopefully, Angela, Dawn, somebody can verify that the slides have advanced for me.
You're good.
Okay, perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Marcia Lacco, the Section Chief of the Environmental Assistance Section of DEQ's Division of Environmental Assistance and Customer Service. I want to welcome you to the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality's ISO 14001 Overview webinar. Over the next several weeks, you will hear from myself, Angela Barger, who's the ESI Program Manager, Don Burke, who's our Membership and Outreach Coordinator, and Scott Pfister, who is one of the program's member coaches. The four of us are the staff that routinely provide EMS training to our members and assist them with their EMS implementation. So hopefully we'll share a lot of the information that we've learned through those interactions. And typically this class is 2 full days, but we've broken it down into 4 half-day sessions to help with comprehension. When we give this class, we liken the information we give you to drinking from a fire hose. So hopefully by breaking them into those 4 sessions, it's easier for folks to understand the information and help you use it if you're one of the organizations that's going to implement an EMS. I wanted to thank our partners, the Land of Sky Regional Council and Waste Reduction Partners, which is a 20-year-old pollution prevention program that provides customized on-site technical assistance. Waste Reduction Partners is a section within our division, but they also, this go around, are a sub-awardee on the pollution prevention grant that our division gets from EPA to assist us with managing the Environmental Stewardship Initiative. All right, so just a couple webinar housekeeping topics. So if you have any audio issues and you're using your computer audio, you can always switch to your telephone. So if you go to the audio tab in the webinar's control box and click phone, you'll see a phone number pop up and a code, and you can use that to access the webinar. If for some reason that doesn't pop up, the call-in information is also in your webinar invite email.
Hey, Marshall.
Oh, go
this
ahead,
is
Don.
Don. Yeah, we do have a couple of attendees that are stating that they are unable to hear.
Okay, so we actually had that issue on another webinar, even for our staff. And so if you go out of the webinar and come back in, that seemed to fix it for us last time. It was some GoToWebinar artifact. So for those folks that are having an issue, pop out of the GoToWebinar and then log back in with your link, and that fixed it for me the last time. So since we have a couple folks that are noting that, we'll give them a chance to go out and go back in. All right, so the other thing that I wanted to highlight is there's a handout section of GoToWebinar, and we're going to be changing out the documents that we have in there as we go along. So for today, we have a PDF copy of the slides that I'm showing. We have also something called a design guidance manual. So that's, we developed that for organizations that are implementing an EMS, and that takes you through the different steps on how to do that. We have a shall statement and a required documentation. That's a Word document, so that highlights everywhere there's a shall statement in the standard and where it requires you to have documentation if you're implementing an EMS. And then specifically for the context section that we're going to be going over today, there's a document called Food for Thought. Just gives you some ideas of some things you might want to think about if you're developing the organizational context. And then we're just going to do an exercise today. So you don't have to print out that worksheet. You don't. You could use it on your computer, or you could just think about the things that we're going to ask you to do. But that's there if that would be helpful to you. And I think I already mentioned that the recording will be sent out. Okay. All right, so we've brought you all in muted. We have over 100 folks that registered today, so we are humbled to be chatting with you about EMS today. And if you have a question, please use the question section of the GoToWebinar. But we're also, especially for our exercise, or if you'd like to provide clarification, you can use the hand raising function. So under the attendees section, you should see your name, and then next to that should be a little hand. And you can click on that, and that'll let us know that you want to chat with us. All right, Don, are we seeing anything else about audio issues?
Scott and I have responded to a couple. Haven't gotten any feedback yet, so
Okay,
I
so
believe we're safe to move on.
okay, so hopefully folks are good with that. I'm gonna turn off my camera so I don't have to keep staring at my face and help with bandwidth. One of the reasons you're going to hear mainly from me today is that our office is just a couple of blocks away from North Carolina's capital. So unfortunately, we decided not to go into the office for the folks that have internet problems. So to save everyone's bandwidth, I'm going to shut my camera off. All right. Okay. So you should have gotten a copy of the agenda that Angela sent out, but just to go over, we're going to, after this little welcome and introductions about both ESI and EMS, the different clauses of the standard we'll go over today are context and interested parties, scope and leadership, policy, and organizational roles. And you're welcome to ask questions throughout, but we find once we get to the end, people may have some additional questions. So we've just got a Q&A at the end. All right, so North Carolina's Environmental Stewardship Initiative. It is a free and voluntary recognition and leadership program. As I mentioned, it's partly funded through EPA Pollution Prevention Grant. And we promote and support outstanding environmental performance. Our NCDEQ secretary has final say, especially about the organizations that move up in the membership. And we are helped through an external advisory board with some of the rules and regulations and guidance on how we operate the program. It began in 2002, and at that time it mirrored EPA's performance track. We started with about 20-something members back then, and currently we have 95 members at 196 facilities. Okay, so this just shows you the 3 different levels of partnership in the program. Our entry level is what we call partners. And for our program, no one can be under criminal indictment or conviction, and partners go through a compliance check with our DEQ regulatory programs. And then we ask them to establish environmental goals. So that can be implementing an EMS or some other type of goal. And then we ask our members to report annually on those goals and their compliance status. Um, for the higher two levels, the rising stewards and stewards, you can see there are other requirements, but for both of them, we ask them to demonstrate a mature EMS. So that's where our EMS touch comes in. And they can either be third-party certified, or if they're not, we will go out and do a functional equivalent audit for them, where we go out, look at the requirements of the ISO 14001 2015 standard, and make sure they're meeting the intent. But they can't use our functional equivalent for any other purpose outside of their ESI membership. Okay. So what do we provide our members? So we provide technical and compliance assistance, and we really tailor that assistance to what our members' needs and goals are. So you can see from those annual reports that our members provided to us in 2019, our members identified 75 different energy reduction goals, 44 water use goals, 28 solid waste goals, and then there were a bunch of other goals that may be specific to that facility. And you can see from the graph on the right, those are the results that our members reported to us. And not all of our members report monetary results. They may consider that proprietary or, confidential business information. And then our first year partners, they don't have to report their first year. So that's probably just a subset of our members. And it's pretty impressive. We had quite a few folks that are either in food and beverage industry or pulp and paper that helped towards that reducing of 1 billion gallons just within 2019 for their water use and 3 billion gallons of wastewater volume. So our members are doing great things. And just from their 2019 projects, that subset reported those $11 million in savings. And as you know from today, we provide educational assistance, we provide EMS assistance. So whether that's training, we'll go out and do those functional equivalent audits, and we also do gap analysis. We've reviewed systems for members before their third-party certification, provide training. We've provided management training. So we do a lot of EMS assistance. And then the last thing that we really, our members value and we value is providing opportunities for them to network and share their ideas. So that's whether about projects that they're doing, things that they have provided, at our, I don't know if you noticed it on the prior slide, our stewards have to have community outreach. So they talk about what they're doing in their community. So it's really a great opportunity. And in normal operational times, a lot of our networking events are at our member sites, but pandemic, pretty much everything is virtual right now. And one of the things we did with our ESI members early on in the pandemic was they wanted to share their back to work practices. So we had a networking event about that. And as you've seen some information, I wasn't supposed to hit that. You've seen some information from Angela, but we also do have a general ESI serve account, which is the esi@ncdnr.gov. So if after today, anytime, feel free to shoot us questions if you have questions about EMSs. And then it's got Angela and Don's specific contact information. All right, so we're going to have a couple poll questions, which Don's going to launch for us. And the first one asks about your level of experience with EMSs.
And it is launched. We'll take about 20 to 30 seconds for this. And just to make sure everybody can see it, what level of experience do you have with environmental management systems? None. This is my first exposure. Some experienced or experienced. A few more seconds here. Looks like the answers have settled in. So I'm going to close the poll. And it looks like 44% lead with some experience. 41% have no experience. This is their first exposure. And 14% are experienced.
Awesome. Well, that's good to know. So hopefully, those of you who don't have any experience, please do not hesitate to ask questions. All right, Don, our second poll relates
All right.
to what do you hope to get from today's class?
Right, I'm launching that now. As Marcia stated, what do you hope to get from this training? General awareness, environmental management systems, an overview of ISO 14001 requirements, both, or other. And while we're waiting, on the prior poll question, it looks like there was a situational exposure awareness that someone was hoping to gain. Okay, looks like we've settled in on these. And 78% for both, 12% an overview of ISO 14001 requirements, 7% general awareness, and 3% an other.
Okay, well, awesome. So hopefully all of the experience that we have had helping organizations implement EMS, we can parlay some of that information to you.
Yeah.
All right, so for our next section, Angela Barger is going to talk to you about what is an EMS.
Hello, everyone. I'm Angela Barger, and I manage the Environmental Stewardship Initiative. And I've been with the DEQ for 21 years and with this particular program for 14. So seriously, if you have any questions about things we've seen over the years, feel free to reach out. We're very laid back when we do this training. So put your questions in the chat at any point. Don't feel like you're interrupting us, and Dawn and Scott will be monitoring that and fielding those questions either via typing back to you, or if it's something that they would like for me to chime in on, then they will bring it up and I will answer it live for everybody. Okay, so what is an EMS? When you hear EMS, what do you think of? And a lot of people, the first thing that pops in their head, especially these days, is emergency medical service. But that's not what it is as far as what we're going to be talking about today. So Marcia, you can go ahead and advance this. Well, it does mean all of these things, just not today. All right, advance again. There you go. And then to the next slide.
All right, so I'm clicking the little button, but it's not cooperating. Hold on.
Okay. I'm one of those people who has really bad internet, so I am speaking, but Marcia's advancing the slides. Otherwise, normally this would be a little bit more fluid. So, an environmental management system, or what we will use EMS to mean today, it's a proven set of tools that's specifically designed to help any organization manage its activities and allow for you to successfully pursue your organization's environmental policies and goals. So it's basically a broad stroke management. ISO 14001, that's when you hear that, no matter what topic they're dealing with, that's what they're about. It's giving you a framework in order to manage a specific type of system. And we'll talk about the different ones that they look at in a little bit. So go ahead and advance. So what does an EMS do? So to provide a systematic way of managing your organization instead of going and picking from just various topics that you've heard in the wind or heard somebody mention in a networking event or something like that. This actually provides you a systematic way of defining what those things are, figuring out what's your priority, and then moving forward with the things that mean the most for your specific site. It helps you to ensure that environmental considerations are a priority, that they don't get lost in the shuffle with all of those other things that are to your ability. But environmental issues, they deserve to serve a priority to you, even though they may not be the thing that's making you money. It also helps to give that order and consistency for your organization to address your environmental concerns, because it requires you to figure out what resources you're going to need. That's not just monetary, that's also full, and it helps you to make sure that you have a responsibility in the certain area of very material management. And then it gives you a built-in system for ongoing evaluation of your practices, your procedures, your processes that are related to those environmental goals. It also helps you to continue to focus on continual improvement of your. That's what all ISO is based on. It's to make sure that you have continual improvement. All right, next slide.
Yep, so you broke up just a little bit there. So we'll monitor that going forward.
Sorry, next slide.
That's okay.
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 All right, so why else might you implement an EMS? Well, like I said, it helps you kind of avoid that flavor of the month and to focus your priorities. It helps you to prioritize and keep sustainability goals from competing with each other, and also from those other goals that are part of your facility, whether that's making widgets or whether that is doing other things, because an EMS can be put into place in any type of organization. It's not just for industries. It also helps you to establish that framework to move beyond compliance. So we're looking to help folks not only meet their permit requirements, but to go above and beyond that and to really establish environmental improvement as one of their baseline pieces of their culture. It's a vehicle for positive change. We've seen improved employee morale because of more folks involved in improving that environmental piece of the puzzle, and seeing that the ideas that they suggest are being implemented, and even sometimes being involved in the implementation of those. It's also good for enhancing your public image, because with improved environmental performance, we're also, reducing the risk of being in the news for something that's a liability. And then, of course, it helps to identify causes. That's one of the things that the system actually requires, is that you have a corrective action system, and that corrective action is to find the cause of any that comes up. Okay, next slide.
Do you see it, Angela?
Marcia? Not yet. Oh, there it goes.
Okay.
Okay. So what is ISO 14001 specifically? So we just talked about environmental management systems generally. ISO 14001 itself is just one environmental management system. It was developed by a non-governmental organization in 100 countries. And ISO, a lot of people think it's just an acronym for International Standardization, just out of order, but it's the Greek word for equal is ISO. So it's basically saying that all of these countries have equal say in developing these different standards. For the US, ANSI, the American National Standards Institute, is our representative, and they are a founding member of ISO, of the ISO group, and they are on many of the different boards and technical committees. ISO 14001 and all of the ISO standards are very widely adopted internationally, particularly in the European Union and Japan, and it's spreading, further and wider. In the US, it kind of started with the big three automakers, and it's kind of moved out from there, the implementation of these management systems, but now it's extremely widely adopted in just about every industry and business sector. Some customers are actually demanding that implementation. Some even require that they get certified to the standard. And by certification, that means that a third party is there to come in and do an assessment of how the system is meeting the requirements that are part of the ISO 14001 standard. So the elements of the standard is what we'll be going over for most of this course over the next 4 Thursday afternoons. But in our particular program, we don't require that our members become certified to the program, just that they are working towards meeting those particular elements. I think, as Marcia mentioned, it's more a matter of, are they meeting the intent of them? Because we don't have the time to spend at each individual site the way somebody who's being paid to be there and certify that system is. So we do have a few facilities that we go out to at least once a year and do that for them, look at their systems and help them to find those opportunities for improvement. It's an auditable standard, which means that it gives you a specific thing you have to do, and then we can go in, or the third-party certifier can go in, or your internal auditors can go in and see if you have met that requirement. And it's compatible and easily integrated with other ISO standards. So these are those other ISO standards I was talking about that we see most frequently. So you've got ISO 9000, which is a quality management system. ISO 50000, which is an energy management system. A lot of folks actually use the 14000, which is what we're talking about today, the environmental one, and incorporate the 50000 into it. 50000 has a lot more prescriptive numerical requirements in it that are not required in ISO 14001. So if you're looking for a little more direction for energy specifically, then you might want to choose 50001 or do both. 45000 is the occupational hazard. If you've been out in industry, you may have heard it called OSAS 18001. That was when it was being operated out of industry-specific trade group. ISO has taken it and incorporated it into their ISO 14 or their ISO management standards list. So, and there are others out there, but these are all of the ones that we see most often. Next slide. What ISO 14000 is not, it's not focused strictly on regulatory compliance. It's looking at, we have several folks in our program that actually don't have any permits at all. The only regulation they're trying to meet are those ordinances, local ordinances, or things that are written into policy, but are not requiring a permit of them. But they still have either a certified system or just a system for their own edification to make sure that they are improving their environmental footprint, because there's always something you can do. And you'll see when we get to policy later today that regulation is only one of the 3 focuses of the standard. It's not a process where you immediately address every single thing. Basically, you make a list of all the different ways that you impact the environment, but then you also prioritize that list and you work on those things that are the most important, the biggest impact first. It's not a performance standard. It's not requiring you to reduce any particular thing by any particular amount. It's about management. It's about continually improving. And it's not an occupational health and safety standard, although I have seen companies use it and then incorporate the health and safety using this model. But as I mentioned, ISO 14001 is the environmental standard. ISO 45001 is the health and safety standard. Okay. All right. So all of the ISO standards are based on a plan, do, check, act, PDCA model of continual improvement. Once you get through this, Marcia, you can go ahead and advance. And the way that works is the elements of the ISO standard are broken down into very specific topics. And we have put them into this chart in a way to kind of help you see how the elements support this continual improvement cycle. So you can see they actually have a whole section called planning. So it makes sense that's the plan section, right? Things there include environmental aspects, which is where you define what your environmental impacts are. And yes, we know that's confusing language, and we're sorry we didn't write it. Your compliance obligations, so that's your legal requirements, but also anything else that you have said that you will do environmentally. You've got your objectives, so those are your environmental goals, and then of course how you're going to plan to achieve those goals. There are two pieces that are newish. One of them is really new, one of them is modified substantially if you're used to the old 2004 version of the standard. So the 2015 version of the standard has added this context of the organization and more emphasis in the leadership. So we've put those actually as framework pieces, but we have seen it actually included in the planning section, and it could easily fall into that planning section. It's just that once those things are established, they tend to not change a whole lot over time, whereas those things that we have set there in that plan box tend to be looked at a lot more frequently and may change more often. As far as the do section, you've got resources, so that's where you define what you need, your competence and awareness, so that's all about the training and what your employees know. Communication, that's how you're getting the message out there, both internally and externally. And then, of course, documented information, so that's where you're creating that whole document control method that you have. And then there's the operational pieces. So that's your operational planning and control, whether that's your work instructions or whether that is putting in a control device for something. And emergency preparedness and response. So making sure that anything that might happen at your facility has been addressed in a way that won't cause any further environmental issues. And we can talk about that further later. In the check section, you've got your performance evaluation piece. So that's all your monitoring and measurement, analysis, and evaluation of your data. It's your internal auditing system that you're required to have, and management review, which is also a requirement. In management review, you're looking at basically all of these other pieces as often as you define that your management needs to see it and provide feedback. And then finally, you've got improvement. So this is your ACT section. And there you're looking at your corrective action system and the general continual improvement statements. And then you start the whole process over. It's circular. You keep doing this cycle over and over, and eventually you should have continual improvement. So that's kind of the general overview of what an environmental management system is, and very high level what ISO 14001 is. So I'm going to pause for a sec, see if anybody has any questions on any of this before we move into the individual elements.
I'm not seeing any questions yet, Angela.
Okay, great. Well, if you have anything as we go along, feel free. I'm online, but Marcia's going to be doing most of the talking until later today. So, all right, Marcia, it's all you.
Okay. All right. So some of you, I think it was what, 14% that they were more experienced in ISO 14001. So there have been 3 versions. The very first version came out in 1999. That was the first one that I was exposed to. Back in the day, it seems like a different life. I lived in New York, and I worked at one of the DOE National Research Labs, and we were the first of the National Research Labs to implement an EMS. So that first standard was around for about 6 years until they added it in 2004. And that one lasted almost, let's see, a little over 10 years. So in 2004, it was 6 pages long versus now it's 11 pages long. There were 18 elements, and that has gone up to 32. There were 12 mandatory documents records, and remember we've got that Word file for you to review. That's now up to 15 places where the standard requires mandatory documents or records. And the shall statements, so that is something you have to do, have increased from 60 to 80 with this newest version. Okay, so for those of you who are going to be working with the standard, we just wanted to point out 2 sections of it that are really helpful. It's really helped us in understanding it when the 2015 version came out, but also helping to teach others about it. So before you get to the different sections that we're going to speak to in a minute, there's a section on terms and definitions. So it tries to give you what that group that got together and makes the decisions on what's going to be included in the standard. They come up with these standard definitions. So for example, top management is defined as a person or group of people who directs and controls an organization at the highest level. And then if they felt that there was some additional information they could give, they put these notes for entry. So for top management, they've got one. The first entry says that top management has the power to delegate the authority and provide resources within the organization. And the second one says is if the scope of the management covers only a part of an organization, then the top management refers to those who direct and control that part of the organization. So I just wanted to highlight that terms and definitions and show you where that is. And then the other section that's really helpful is the annex. So the annex provides guidance on the use of the standard. And in A1, it gives you some general information, and then it goes about in the different sections providing clarification. So for example, in A3, and we'll try and highlight these as we go through the different clauses. So one of the concepts that we always try to highlight to folks is there is a difference between the words consider and ensure in the standard. So if you see the word consider, it means that it's necessary to think about the topic, but it can be excluded from your system. Whereas take into account means it is necessary to think about the topic, but it cannot be excluded. So if you're one of the folks that were noted that you were implementing an EMS, really look at this back annex section. And then another area is the word ensure means that the responsibility can be delegated, but not the accountability. So that really would affect top management. All right. So we're going to dig in now to what the standard actually says. So it starts with clause 4, which is context and leadership of the organization. So there's 4 sections within clause 4. The first 2, understanding your organization and its context and the needs and expectations of interested parties, are new and introduced in the 2015 standard, whereas scope and environmental management systems, they were concepts that were included in the prior version. Okay, so one of the things that was really obvious to us back in 2015, 2016, when we started looking at the standard, is that it has a sustainability push. It allows, and some of the things that it requires, helps organizations that want to increase their sustainability. And as most of us are aware, a lot of people are looking to use more organic, use safer chemicals, and they're looking to the companies that provide them either with products or services, or the employers that they may work for to be more sustainable. The other thing that we're looking for, transparency and accountability, which has really helped out in the standard, through your communication and the things that it asks you to do. Other pieces, we have a compliance obligations piece and making sure organizations know where they are with those compliance obligations. So that helps with legislation that may be applicable. And then just the other things that people normally think about when you think about the environment. So people are concerned about, efficient use of resources, proper waste management, and not degrading the ecosystem or the organisms that use it. And I just threw this one in. We use this in our module series where we get into a little more detail, but I thought it would be good for you guys to see. It's a little outdated because it came out in 2019. The Government and Accountability Institute produced a report that noted 86% of the S&P 500 index, those 500 companies that make that up, published sustainability and responsibility reports in 2018. And that increased from about 20%, and that was just in 2011. So you can see that it has ramped up really quickly, the interest in sustainability. And as I noted, you know, both institutional and retail investors are expecting and demanding greater corporate ESG disclosure. All right, so where does sustainability come into with ISO 14001? So the standard has always asked you to look at how your organization impacts the environment. But part of that piece, and Angela alluded to that with emergency preparedness, it's also preventing and mitigating any adverse environmental impacts that your organization may have. And then I'll talk about it in a minute. It's also mitigating the potential adverse effects of the environment on your organization. As I mentioned, it assists with fulfillment of its compliance obligations. So one of the big reasons our organization back in New York got asked or put an EMS in place, actually came out of an EPA multimedia inspection. And we have a couple members within our program. One of the regional reasons they came on was to help improve their compliance. And as many of our members note, they can achieve financial and operational benefits as a result from the environmentally sound alternatives or the projects that they put in place. And that can help them from a business standpoint as an organization. And then the standard helps folks respond to those changing environmental conditions in balance with socioeconomic needs. And that's probably one of the highlights right now with our pandemic going on. You know, folks are having to figure out how to deal with that and the additional expense from that while also trying to maintain their environmental programs. So where in the standard is sustainability highlighted? So we're going to talk about in a minute. Organizational context, knowing how your organization affects and is affected by the environment, society, and economics. Identifying those interested parties that are going to be interested in what you're doing and how you meet the expectations. The standard introduces something called the life cycle perspective, and Angela will talk about this in one of our next sessions. It's not a full-on life cycle analysis, but it's a life cycle perspective, looking at from cradle to grave and your environmental operations. The standard also introduces the concepts of risks and opportunities. So what are those areas that could be a risk to your organization, and what are the opportunities that you can seize on through an EMS? And one of the other ways we want to highlight is leadership. So once you put an EMS in place, under prior versions, sometimes it was left up to one person. The prior standard called them environmental management reps. But the standard is really designed so that you have a system, and if someone in your organization leaves, that your system doesn't fall apart because that one person left. And the last thing that this new version of the standard does, there's a big alignment of your EMS with the strategic direction of the organization. Sorry guys, I'm not sure why my nose keeps running. Okay, so in clause 4.1, understanding the organizational context. So the folks that wrote the standard recognize that organizations don't operate within the bubble. And the context is designed to be really a high-level conceptual understanding of where your organization sits. And the issues that could either positively or negatively affect it as you try and implement your EMS and deal with your environmental responsibilities. And those same factors can affect the successful implementation of your EMS. And as you'll see, as I mentioned, you know, there's only, what did I say, 80 shells and 15 places where you need documentation. there is a lot of room to tailor your EMS to what your organization needs. Okay, so in section 4.1, understanding context, it says that the organization shall determine the external and internal issues that are relevant to your purpose and that affect your ability to achieve the intended outcomes of your EMS. And they shall include environmental conditions being affected by or capable of affecting your organization. So that's a really big new concept that they've introduced. And so at the bottom of the slide, you'll see I've tried to highlight, the external issues that could affect an organization. Where might that affect you and how you put your EMS in place? So that's going to affect the scope that you deem what operations you pull in within your EMS scope. It's going to affect those compliance obligations, your communications, and your budgets, right? So I just mentioned the pandemic. Everyone's dealing with pandemic implications on your organization. So that'll affect your budget and what you can, resources that you can apply to your EMS. And then internally within your organization, right? That's going to determine how your EMS is designed. We have quite a few members that have employees that either do not have English as their primary language, or we even have a couple members that have folks that are hard of hearing, so they have to deal with that. The other big way that internal issues can affect how your EMS is implemented, that culture within your organization and that institutional knowledge, that's going to affect how you're going to implement your EMS. And also, how many folks do you have that can really put their resources into helping with your EMS implementation and the continual improvement that you need for it. Okay, so those external issues. So they are defined as those that are relevant to your organization's purpose and can affect the ability to achieve it. So we've put some examples here on the bottom, and it could be just about everything. As I'll go to it in the next slide, you can think about all these things, but you don't always have to write them down, but you need to be consistent about what it is that you're looking at. And I'll go into why that is in just a minute. Internal issues, we got some examples up here, and I've mentioned them already. It's going to affect your strategic direction, your culture, the capabilities, your institutional knowledge, the systems that you put in place, training, finances, corporate requirements. And then finally, the last piece of context is environmental. And so the 2004 version of the standard only had the organization looking at their impacts on the environment. But in 2015, they circle back and they ask you to think about, how can the environment affect you? Because that can be climate change, that could be air quality. In North Carolina, we go through drought cycles, so not like clockwork, but usually it's about 7 to 10 years. We have drought conditions, so that affects a lot of the organizations in our state and how they implement their EMS. Are there land use restrictions and existing contaminations? Resource availability. We've seen this a lot. Oop, I'm sorry. I didn't hit the advance. I just clicked on my screen. One of the other sections within our part of DEECS works with our economic development partners in the state, and we've seen a lot of people interested in coming to the state so that they can bring their supply chain back within the U.S. Because that's been severely affected because of the pandemic. And one of the last things about environmental conditions, it can affect your mission, what your environmental aspects are, and it can play a role in the life cycle of your products and services. Okay, so I mentioned that one of the handouts is this document called Design Guide Food for Thought. So when we were looking at this standard originally, we developed this document as something for folks to look at and think about as things you may want to include in your organizational context. And this is just a screenshot. It does include everything, but if you're someone that's implementing an EMS and you look at our document, if you see something you think that should be included, please let us know. We have used our members to help expand this thing, and it's been a great tool. All right. So the standard, you're going to have to figure out within your organization how you identify what is contained in your organizational context, and you have to make a decision about documenting it. So this is one of the areas where there is no shall statement. It does not say that you have to have documentation for your context. But one of the things we like to point out to our members is, make a decision and then your rationale should be evident, so that if you are one of the folks that have an outside auditor that comes in and reviews what you do, and they start talking to you about what your context is, it's good to have it documented from the standpoint that you can point to it. Whereas if you don't document it and you have to describe it, if they come back over time, you may describe that differently. So that's one of the areas where it's good to have documentation. All right, so once you develop your organizational context, we've just highlighted the other places in the standard that refer back to it. So once you develop it, the standard requires you to consider your organizational context when you're developing your scope. And it notes that your policy and your objectives have to be compatible with your context. And then it requires that you consider your organizational context when you're planning for your EMS, identifying those risks and opportunities to your organization in the EMS, and you have to review changes to those internal and external issues during your management review. So in deciding how you're going to document your EMS, it helps with reviewing those changes that it asks you to review. Okay, so we've got some examples for you from our members. So we've had quite a few members put their context in the EMS manual. And so for those of you that are not familiar with an EMS, organizations may choose to put in what's called an EMS manual. It's like an overarching document that provides some description of things that may apply to all the pieces and parts of the EMS. So context is a really good piece to put in an EMS if you're developing one of, an EMS manual if you're developing one of those. So this is an example from one of our members where they talk about their context and then they spelled it out. So they put down their external issues and then later on in the document they talk about internal issues. And they've rolled in some of their compliance pieces also. And as we go out and look at our members and help them with their context, we had a local municipality, it's their solid waste division that has implemented EMS and is part of our program. And so they were having a really hard time about how are we, what do we have to put in this context? And we went out there and we were doing an FE, we found out that they develop a strategic planning document. And a lot of the things that the context asked you to think about was actually in their strategic plan. So we're like, don't reinvent the wheel, just reference it where you can. All right, so we have another member that's implemented it through an EMS, and we are lucky to have the NC Zoological Park as a member. And so they've put it in and also put an EMS. And much like the other facility, they've got different sections. So this one's about external. And once we read all of the zoo stuff, they have a lot of interested parties, which we'll go over that definition in the next part. Okay. We also had a member that put it in an SOP, but they did it in the context of a SWOT analysis. So strengths, weaks, opportunities, and threats. And they broke it down to internal strengths and weaknesses, and then external opportunities and threats. So we thought that was a really great way to look at your organization and really roll in that strategic orientation piece that's spoken to in the context. And then the last example we have is one of our members. They combined it with their aspects and impacts. Angela will discuss this. I think it's in session 2 of the 4. You can see in that second column, what they call pestle is where they pulled in some of the things from the context. So what were the political, economic, social, technological, legal, and ecological things that could be related to their aspects? And then you can see in the fifth column from the left, they talk about the needs and expectations and those legal requirements and whether that comes from corporate or plant. So sometimes you don't have to have all of these things broken out separately. You can put them all together if that works with how you're implementing your EMS. Okay, so that's the end of the organizational context. Dawn or Scott, do we have any questions come in?
There are no questions at this time, Marcia.
Okay, perfect. All right, so we're going to go into the next section, which is understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties, which is a new term in the 2015 version. And so the standard defines an interested party as either a person or an organization that can be affected by, or perceive itself to be affected by a decision or activity. And that's like, whoa, what do you mean perceive? And so they've gone on to explain that to perceive itself to be affected means that that perception has been made known to you. So either, if you're interested, or they've written you a letter, or they've participated in community outreach, or some way they've had to have made known their interest to your organization. So that takes that giant group and brings it down to earth. Okay, so who could be interested parties? So you've got both internal and external interested parties. So internally, your employees, contractors or suppliers. If you're an organization that's publicly owned, not publicly owned, on the stock market, so you could have investors. If it's within a corporation, you can have corporate oversight as an internal interested party, that facilities management team, versus external, the folks, if you provide a service or a product, the consumers of those, the applicable regulators to your organization, if you're within a trade group, the folks that live around your facility, elected officials, and those in the community, and environmental advocates. So go back to the example of our solid waste group. It seems every time that we go out and do an FE with them, we're identifying additional interested parties to their EMS and things, folks. They know who their interested parties are, but we'd suggest that they then go back and review and make sure there aren't any compliance obligations. So it's really interesting. They have a landfill as one of their operations, and when you drive up to it, on the outside, it looks like it's a subdivision. You wouldn't know it was a landfill unless somebody told you, or you looked on a map, or you saw the large number of trucks going in and out. And so early on in their operation, they developed a group to work with their neighbors. And then after a certain amount of time, that agreement sort of expired, but they still go by the agreement and how they operate it. So that was one of the discussions we had with them about interested parties. Okay, so the standard requires that the organization shall determine the interested parties, both internally and externally, that are relevant to your EMS, that those relevant needs and expectations, what the standard calls requirements, are of those interested parties. And then once you identify those needs and expectations, you identify which become a compliance obligations. And so for some things, you do have a choice of what becomes a compliance obligation. So for those of you familiar with the 2004 standards, they had broken it up and they used to call it legal requirements and other requirements. And basically what the new version does is just put those together and call them both compliance obligations. And as I mentioned, they can arise from mandatory things such as laws, regulations, or administrative codes, or they can be voluntary commitments, either from your organization, industry standards, contractual relationships, agreements with community groups, or as we like to point out for all of our ESI members, once you become a member, we become an interested party because we require you to submit an annual report. Okay. So just like your organizational context, you need to figure out, or you as in your organization, needs to figure out, who's going to be involved in those decisions, who's an interested party, identifying those needs and expectations, and then determining your compliance obligations. And then you need to make a decision about documenting. So again, with this one, much like organizational context, back in the management review, you have to look at changes to the needs and expectations of interested parties. And some of the other areas where interested parties is mentioned in the standard requires you to consider your compliance obligations when developing your scope. It notes that your policy and scope must be available to interested parties. It requires you to provide relevant information and training related to emergency preparedness and response as appropriate to interested parties, including those working under your control, and we'll go over what that means in one of the next sessions. And it requires you consider your interested parties and compliance obligations when you plan your EMS, when you identify those risks and opportunities. And as I said, you have to consider those changes during your management review. All right, so let's see, what time is it? All right, so it is 2 o'clock. And what we're gonna do now is we're gonna do a little exercise. So I'm gonna read to you an example of an organization, and then we're just gonna have you guys look at it and try and identify those internal, external, and environmental aspects that could be the organization's context. So for those of you that have your own EMS, you can either use this Lone Mountain Mining as something different, or you could look to your organization when we get to the exercise piece. So I'm just going to have to switch gears here a little bit with presentations, so just bear with me. Gonna end
So while
this.
Marsha's doing that, if you look in the handouts, you'll see a Lone Mountain exercise context of organization. You can use that form, and as she goes through that, come up with some of the answers while she's talking.
All right, Angela, will you verify you're seeing Lone Mountain Mining?
I am.
Sweet.
And the other document that might be helpful for you as she goes through it is the food for thought, which is also in the handouts. So if you open that up, it kind of gives you some examples to use.
Right, so we have to give credit. So when we go through our ISO lead auditor training, we've used the same contractor for probably 2 or 3 times now. And so this is an example that they had provided, and they said that we could use it. And so we've tailored it a little bit to North Carolina. And so we're going to use it. So as I go through this and I describe the organization and how they operate, just be thinking about, what are those things that are external to the organization that could affect how it operates or its EMS, internal, and then how is the organization affected by or could affect the environment. So this is Lone Mountain Mining, which is a 90-year-old limestone mine and processing operation located in the foothills of the Great Smoky Mountains. And it's been operating under its current management for about 15 years. It has 40 employees, and the mine operates year-round, Monday to Friday during the day. The sizing of the produced limestone is carried out during the evenings to obtain lower electricity rates. And their equipment maintenance is conducted on weekends as needed. The mine has coverage under an NPDES permit for both its treated wastewater and its industrial stormwater. And the facility carries an air permit exemption due to its current production rate. The mine has two main customers. The first is the agricultural business, as limestone is used for soil treatment. They are a less demanding customer base, and that is seasonal in nature. And then the other main customer for the mine is the glass industry. So the limestone must meet more demanding color specifications that requires chemical additions, and this is a year-round customer for the mine. All right, so as you see on slide 1, this is the entrance road into the mine, showing the closeness of some of the mine's neighbors in the condominiums, but they are not inhabited year-round. And as you can see, this is a customer truck, but the customers are the ones that provide the trucks and transport the finished limestone off-site. Okay. This is the narrow 2-lane access road in the mining area. So it's at an elevation about 2,500 feet. It's heavily forested with oak trees, and it usually snows at this elevation in the winter. Okay. There are several signs on the mine property reminding truck drivers that the mine's neighbors are sensitive to noise from the trucking operations. And the signs also note the posted speed limits and that they're to be observed, and that Jake brakes or engine compression braking systems should not be used when they're on site. Okay, so this is a picture of the closest neighbor that lives in their home year-round. The area surrounding the mine is really remote and filled with wildlife, and it's not unusual to round a turn and see a herd of deer on the property. This gives you some pictures of the storage and blending silos that are on site, and shows the truck preparation area where truckers stop to wash off their trucks to minimize the dust that they create. The limestone operation is an open pit mining process where the limestone is removed from the substrate by blasting. And as you can see, the signs caution visitors about the blasting operation and that the use of their radios is prohibited as they may detonate the explosive charges. This just shows you the main office area for the mine, so nothing high tech. The mine is a terraced mine operation, and that helps reduce erosion. They take core samples to determine the limestone chemistry and the blending that is used to achieve that desired chemistry for the glass customers. This shows you the first step in the size reduction process. And this shows that the limestone is transported from various operations on site via conveyor belt, and that some of those are covered, but not all of them. These are some additional views of the sizing and crushing operations, including storage areas and blending for the final product. Material that falls from the conveyor system is reclaimed and reintroduced into the process. These are the loadout bins containing finished product that loads the trucks provided by the mine's customers. And that's just an example of a truck being loaded. Dust is often a problem generated through the mining, sizing, blending, and distribution of the limestone. This is a regulatory concern as well as health and safety concern for the mine, its employees, visitors, and neighbors. And they use water as their main dust control. All right, this is a view of the maintenance building in the areas where small sacks of limestone are provided to customers. And this shows some additional storage and maintenance areas and really the size of the vehicles that are used on site. This is the point where processed wastewater is routed for treatment. So the limestone is washed to remove soil and clay, and flocculant is added to help precipitate sediment and debris. Their treated wastewater is discharged through outfall 1 to Sky Blue Lake. The wastewater pond is mucked out periodically to ensure adequate treatment volume, and resultant sediment is used in mine reclamation. And this, our final picture, shows you, as I just mentioned, Sky Blue Lake. It's a fairly remote area, and this is the part of the mine that overlooks the river that's been dammed up about a mile downstream to create Sky Blue Lake. And this lake is a recreational area for both trout and bass fishing. All right, so let me end this and we'll go back to the other one. So what you're going to do, and you can either do this using the exercise sheet that we gave you or jot it down on a piece of paper. But we want you to think about one internal issue that would be relevant to the Lone Mountain Mining's context, one external issue, and one environmental. And like I said, if you're an organization that already has your EMS, you can default to using your organization, or feel free to use Lone Mountain Mining as something different to think about. And so I've got 209. So we're going to use this as an opportunity for you guys to work on this example and also take a break. If folks need it to get up, to stretch, you know, get what you need. So let's reconvene. Don, Angela, Scott, 2:25 or 2:30? We're supposed to go to 4. How about we give everybody till 2:30? Give everybody a nice 20-minute break. All right, and we'll meet you all back here at 2:30 in 20 minutes.
Sounds good.
All right, folks, I've got 2:29, so we'll officially wait till 2:30, and then we'll get started back up. All right, so since I have the official clock, it is now 2:30. I hope everyone enjoyed their break, got to think about organizational context. So we're going to try and use that hand raising feature now in class. And you remember, if you go to the attendees section, you should see your name, and there should be a hand next to it. And by clicking on your hand, that's how we know that you are interested in speaking.
Yeah, we've got a couple popping in, Marcia. Well,
Okay,
they popped on and then they popped off. So maybe they're
okay,
just practicing. So
that's okay. So if we have any volunteers to share what they came up with, either internally or externally, or some environmental issues to think about, either your organization or Lone Mountain Mining.
okay, we have Heidi. Let's see, Heidi, it looks like you're, let me try unmuting you. Okay, Heidi, you're live,
Hi.
I believe. Yeah,
Hi.
go ahead.
So in listening to the description of Lone Mountain and its operations, several things occurred to me. They are adding chemicals to some of their products for the glass industry. So I would be concerned about management of those chemicals, both when they come onto the site and when they're used. The fact that they're overlooking a lake and that was a dammed river, apparently. I would be interested in knowing where that chemicals storage and use facility was located in connection to that lake. So in case I had concerns about spills, because they were in a proximity that would allow a spill
Oh,
to
we
contaminate the
lost you,
lake, if
Heidi.
there
I
was
don't know if you're
concern about the chemicals.
self-muted or
No, I'm
No.
not
dropped.
intentionally.
I could still hear her. Yeah.
Okay, I was going to say, it says I have a little green disc, so I think I'm talking.
Now
Yeah,
you are. We could hear you.
you didn't break up on my end. So
Oh, I wonder
Okay.
why. Oh,
The entrance road, if the point at which that was taken was a private road coming into the facility, if they'd already left the public roads, I would be concerned about making sure that road was sufficiently maintained to not cause any potential for accidents for trucks entering and leaving the facility, and causing a spill, even though limestone may be relatively benign. The fact that it has stuff mixed into it, and I don't know what that stuff is right now, I would want that to be of concern. So those are the things that popped in my mind first, was being really aware of where those chemicals are on the site and how they're being managed, and really aware of movement on the site by trucks, whether it's the entrance road or even roads within the facility around the mine, being sure that they are in a condition that will not encourage or cause an accident.
great points. You got in the some of the environmental issues you should be thinking about, and also, with the roads, that ties in the neighbors and truck noise and environmental impacts from that. Good job.
thanks, Heidi. I'm not seeing any other responses at this time. Oh, here we go. Ben, I'm going to unmute you. You've got the floor. You there, Ben?
Ben, you might be muted on your end too. Sometimes that happens.
No. Well, let's see. I'll leave him unmuted on my end for now, but that's about it.
All righty. Okay, so usually when we have this class in person, I tell folks to use their imagination. So I'll give you a couple of examples of things that I came up with when I was originally coming up with our exercise. So for internal, I stop scrolling on my own screen. I put the production manager and the geologist were nearing retirement age. So the organization would need to ensure that their documentation of processes is up to date and that they were doing cross training of staff to make sure they had a good continuity of when staff transitioned either to retirement or to new positions. So I had that as an internal issue to think about.
Let's see. I've got Ben did send a message, Marcia. Just
Okay.
basically indicated he was unmuted, but apparently we couldn't hear him on our end. So yeah.
Okay.
That was in the chat box. So.
All right. Let's see. So I gave you an internal one. I had an external one. So
real quick, Julia has something through the questions box.
okay.
Internal issue or factor could be the wastewater from washing trucks.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Julia.
Need to manage that properly, right? So one of the things I had as an external issue was that the mine currently has a good relationship with those neighbors, that live close by, and a stable group of customers that are providing the truck drivers. But some of those drivers do change over time, so they have to worry about making sure that all of the new drivers understand the requirements, especially on site with not using jake brakes, not using their radios, and making sure that those folks are trained when they come on site.
Okay. And Dalton had a comment through the questions box. Fuel storage that's used for machinery.
Good point. Yeah. So you need to think about that depending on what it is. Are there any regulatory requirements for secondary containment? Circling back to our first comment, is that in an area that could get into a stormwater drain or somehow get off site? So, yep, good point. All right, so I'll give you another one of my internal ones because I was a bit feeling cheeky when I was doing this. So I put that some of the staff have a language barrier. Some of them speak Polish instead of English, and that goes back to my roots. Especially the new maintenance mechanics, so you needed to conduct additional training or translation of procedures to ensure that language barrier does not affect the repairs or the mine operations or proper disposal of waste.
Okay.
Don, were you going to mention we had something else?
Yeah, Jean, through the question box, mentions used oil issues.
Yep, so used oil, another one. Yep, definitely. They got a lot of machinery on site and probably have a lot of use of new and virgin oil, and how do you manage those? Good job. All right, Don, anybody else popping up?
I don't, I'm scanning. Don't have any right now. So, okay.
Okay. All right, so I'll throw another one out, sort of relates to strategic direction of the organization. So I had put down that glass production, remember they were one of the two main customers. That's been up. So they may need additional limestone processing at the mine. So that would be good. It would increase the company's sales and profits. And glass production is projected to steadily increase. You know, lots of folks want new cell phones, new tablets, new laptops, especially during the pandemic. And these guys are the only supplier in the southeast part of the United States, did you know? So that's good, but so that's an opportunity for the organization, but risk, as we'll trying to transition to some of these other concepts we're going to be talking about later. A risk is that, you know, depending on how much they have to ramp up production, that may negate that exemption for their air permit going forward. So they may have increased regulatory issues to worry about. Go ahead, Don.
We have an additional one, and I do apologize. It's a great name either way, Andrea or Andrea. Mentions city departments, which include economic and environmental, and that are interested in regulatory compliance.
Great addition. Yeah, so those interested parties could be your regulators, and you know, depending on where the facility is, whether there's any. It's a little more rural, so maybe if there's any county requirements they have to meet where they're located, and then North Carolina, we're delegated for a lot of the big regulatory programs: air, water, hazardous waste, UST. So if there are any state requirements for what's going on at Lone Mountain Mining.
Great.
Okay, is that it, Don?
That looks to be about it.
Okay, so this was just sort of an exercise to get you thinking about those three different elements that context wants you to think about. Because as we
have,
go ahead, Don.
I'm sorry, Heidi is back in the questions box. A comparison of how people are doing their jobs compared to how the documentation says they do their job.
Good, great example of something that you could do during an internal audit, right? So we're going to talk about all the different requirements that ISO 14001 asks you to put in place. And so when you develop documentation that's related to your ISO standard, that's something that could be audited, either both internally by you or by an outside certifier, or you know, a second party such as ourselves, ESI. So you compare what the procedure says you should be doing to what people are actually doing, and make sure they're doing what they say, or you know, maybe they may have changed something because it made their job easier, and your procedure just needs to catch up. All right, excellent example, Heidi. All right. So, well, I hope you guys found that a little helpful. Go ahead, Don. We got something
No,
else
Heidi has a follow-up. There used to be a 14001 lead auditor about a decade ago, and this was a common issue.
Okay. So for folks that are within our program, we give what we refer to as internal auditors. So we help them develop internal auditing skills, but we also have hired outside consultants to take ISO lead auditor, which is something that folks can get certified in, being a lead auditor for ISO.
Yeah, Heidi just inserted that she used to be a 14001 lead auditor a decade ago, and this was a common issue. So yeah.
There we go. Thank you, Heidi. All right, so I'm gonna advance. Hopefully, y'all seeing 4.3 now?
Thank everybody for their participation. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Perfect. Technology is not failing me today. Yay. Okay, so we're gonna move on to scope, which is 4.3. And the standard says that the organization shall determine the boundaries and applicability of your EMS to establish its scope. And what you have to consider includes those external and internal issues that you defined in 4.1, which is your context, and the compliance obligations which you defined in reviewing your interested parties. You also have to look at your organizational units, functions, and your physical boundaries, all of your activities, products, and services, and then the authority and ability to exercise control and influence over those when you develop your scope. And so once your scope is defined, then all of those activities, products, and services within that scope need to be included in your EMS. And sometimes folks will sequentially add things to their EMS, so there may be some things you do that aren't within your scope, especially if you're doing that phase implementation of an EMS. But the standard says that the scope shall be maintained as documented information. So this is the first location where it requires you to have a document that someone that's coming in to audit to you can look at, and then it must be available to interested parties. So that's something new. And so we always tell folks, being available to interested parties, you could just write something that says it will be available upon request, and that meets the intent of the standard. But it's really up to your organization on how you want to make your scope available to interested parties. And another way a lot of people have their scope is that they'll post it maybe along with their policy in their entranceway. And one of the big things to remember about the scope is that it's those things that you have control and influence over. So you get to choose what's going to be in your scope. And this is an area where we tell folks, think about the things that you might want to exclude. So we have some facilities that have cell phone towers on their sites that they have no control over. They lease that part out to someone else, and so they've excluded that from their scope. Folks will exclude, if they have a nursing station, they will exclude that from their EMS from a HIPAA compliance standpoint. If you have a transformer on site, so in North Carolina, Duke Energy is a main provider of energy, so a lot of times folks will exclude the Duke owned and maintained transformer from their EMS. Okay. Find my button to advance. All right. So the last section in clause 4 is just something that's entitled Environmental Management System, and it really gives auditors a place to look if they need an area to put a generalized comment about an EMS. So it says, to achieve the intended outcomes, including enhancing its environmental performance, the organization shall establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve in EMS, including the processes needed and their interactions, and that the organization shall consider the knowledge gained by the evaluations of your context, your needs and expectations of interested parties when establishing and maintaining the EMS. I mean, you'll hear me say this and probably Ange and some the rest of our scope. 2015 is a little redundant. They say kind of the same thing in a couple different places. So this is one of those areas. All right, so that ends the first clause. And we're going to move into clause 5, which deals with leadership. So that's split into leadership and commitments, developing your environmental policy, and then establishing your organizational roles, responsibilities, and authorities. And as I note on that slide, this leadership clause is new. There wasn't a standalone clause in the 2004 version. There was some language referring to leadership. But as you know, an EMS is not successful without the commitment from all levels and functions within an organization, and that commitment needs to be led by top management. And as I just said, it was alluded to that management should be very involved in EMS, but it didn't require it. And so a lot of times, and we saw this with some of our members, their system may have been relying on one person, and I think I mentioned this earlier today. And sometimes systems will fail if it's all on one person. So the group that came up with this is really by putting this ownership on leadership, trying to distribute the responsibility for making sure your EMS is successful. And as I defined before, top management is those person or group of people who direct and control an organization at the highest level, and they have the power to delegate authority and to provide resources within the organization. So the intent is that top management should direct or be personally involved in the specific responsibilities, and I believe I took this from the annex of the standard. And they have to demonstrate their leadership and commitment, but top management can delegate those responsibilities, but they retain the accountability for ensuring that the actions are performed. Okay, so the standard says that top management shall demonstrate leadership and commitment with respect to the EMS. So before I delve into these, I just want to sort of describe how we go about it when we go out and do a functional equivalent. So sometimes we'll see that folks have written these specific, there's 9 commitments in the standard, have written it into either their EMS manual or they have it in an SOP. But we like to get top management together and just have a discussion and ask them pointed questions to the different items that are spelled out here and use that conversation as a way to determine whether top leadership has made that commitment. So the standard says that they have to take accountability for the effectiveness of the EMS. They must ensure the environmental policy and objectives are established and compatible with the strategic direction and that context of the organization that you've identified. They have to ensure that the EMS, the integration of the EMS into the organization's business processes, and they have to ensure that the resources needed for the EMS are available. Excuse me. The other part, it says that they shall communicate the importance of the effectiveness of environmental management and conforming to the EMS's requirements, ensuring that the EMS achieves its intended outcomes, directing and supporting persons to contribute to the effectiveness of the EMS, promoting that continual improvement that Angela spoke to, that plan, do, check, act cycle. And then this is a big one, supporting the other management. So, you know, if it's a large enough organization, there could be some middle managers, supporting them in demonstrating leadership as it applies to their areas of responsibility. So as I stated, there was 9 different items, but there was no requirement for that to be documented. But as I stated, we've seen some of our members put it in to EMS manuals or SOPs, just so you have that there. But really it's through either those conversations, or sometimes we'll look at, you know, what has come out of management review, how interactive are they with the day-to-day interactions with staff and implementing the EMS. You know, if it's a new organization, were they involved in kickoff meetings? Are they regularly involved in EMS meetings? The standard will talk about this. One of the future things for management review, you know, that's supposed to be done at periodic intervals. So how often are they doing their management reviews? What are they reviewing? All those sorts of things. And top management can get a real interesting. So for those EPA folks on the line, the EPA's RTP campus is actually in our ESI program. So they have, I believe it's 12 different divisions that are actually located on that site, but it's the 3 divisions that have the most folks over there that have taken the lead in making sure that the EMS on site is implemented. So when we had our in-person discussions and interviews with top management, I think we had like almost 10 people sitting around the table with us and having that discussion about, you know, how do they determine what resources are needed? How do they go about planning for the EMS? How are they involved in the audits, and how do they support the other folks on site? Don, did we have a question?
Yeah, we do. It's from Julia. She asked, what about the need for an environmental policy signed by leadership?
Well, Angela is going to talk about policy. So that policy is, or signing of policy is another way that leadership can show commitment, especially if you review that and your policy changes over time. But having those top managers sign your policy is a great way for them to show that they are committed to the EMS. And hopefully that was what you wanted to learn, Julia, through your question. But if not, type it in and we'll answer it again. One of the other ways I think it was really interesting, what our RTP folks did was they did a video. They helped management make a video of how the EMS is implemented there, and then how different staff are committed to making sure it's successful. All right. So this was just an example of one of our members, and so they had a management responsibility list and they spelled out. So this was a company that had a CEO and a vice president, and they identified what they were responsible for and highlighted different areas. Okay. So policy, actually, Angela is going to speak to you about policy if we don't have any further questions, Dawn.
No, we do not.
Okay.
Right. So it looks like we'll probably be done early because we're getting near the end of today's material, which is a good thing for everybody. We'll give you some time back.
That's right.
So moving on to policy. As Julie was asking about policy, I was like, oh, that's good timing because I'm coming up next. So the standard actually requires that top management establish, implement, and maintain an environmental policy within your scope that Marcia just talked about. This is a little bit of a change from previously. I think in the 2004 version, it said the organization shall establish that. It doesn't mean that top management has to write it by hand if they have delegated authority for managing the EMS. Then that group can propose a policy for them to actually sign off on. A signature is not a requirement, but as Marcia was saying, it is a good way to show that top management was involved with that establishment and support that policy should be thought of as core to the business functions. That policy, though, has to be appropriate to the purpose and context of the organization. Marcia's been talking about context a lot. So think about, your policy and how things can be implemented within that policy, and you're not committing to saving the world. You don't want to go outside of your scope because there's not really a whole lot you can do that would affect the entire world. You want to affect what you can affect. So make sure you're not over committing within your policy, but you also don't want to undercommit either. The policy should provide a framework for setting your environmental goals. But it has to include 3 commitments. And those are slightly different from the 2004 version, but not a lot. If you've implemented a policy through a previous version of the standard, it's pretty close. One of the things that was expanded, though, was in the previous version, you had to commit to preventing preventing pollution. The new standard, though, includes the commitment to protect the environment, including prevention of pollution, and any other specific commitments that are relevant to your organization. You still have to have a commitment to fulfill your compliance obligations. Previous versions called this legal and other. It means the same thing. This is going beyond just those legal requirements that are in your permits. This is anything else that you've agreed to meet or that are part of other commitments that you've made, like being part of Energy Star, or being part of our program, or having customers put requirements on you for environmental obligations that you agree to meet as part of being a vendor for that customer. You also have to have a commitment for continual improvement to the EMS. So this one has been in there since the very beginning. You've always had to have that as part of your policy. And it really makes sense because that is the core of having an ISO environmental system. It also, this is the one thing, there are only 2 items that have to be public or available to interested parties as it's stated now. It's your policy and your scope. It used to be the scope didn't have to be available to interested parties. That's new, but your policy does. That's not a huge deal for us who are public entities. You know, everything we do is public information, but for some, you know, companies that like to keep things close to the vest, it's good to know what pieces of your system have to be available to anyone who's interested. So that would be your policy and your scope, and that's it. It also has to be maintained as documented information, so you have to have it written down somewhere. But notice that it doesn't say it has to be signed to your question, Julia. But it does have to be communicated within the organization. So how are you getting the information about your policy out to your employees? And I also wanted to make a note. I don't remember if Marcia said it at the beginning, but since we have 3 more days or 3 more afternoons going through different parts of the standard, I wanted to point this out on the slide. Anytime you see shall, we've pointed that out in all of our slides by making it red and italicized, just to kind of point out all of those different auditable statements within the standard itself. And then anytime you're required to have documented either a document like a SOP or any other kind of document, we have put that in purple italics just to kind of point that out. And we know our slides are a lot of words. We do that on purpose in order to give you something to look back on after the class is over and refer to. This is almost the entire standard. We left out some words and notes, and we don't have the annex and the definitions in there. So if you're just looking to kind of do a quick refresh on what a specific element is, this is one way you can do it. Just look back through our slides real quick. So when we do this in person, we give a notebook with this actually printed out for you. So that's the reason we have wordy slides. We know that's not a good presentation method, but it seems to work for trainings. All right, Marcia, next slide. All right, so this is just a summary of that policy and what you need to do. You have to have those 3 commitments, must be communicated and available to interested parties. But the main thing I like about this slide is this quote over here, where it talks about the difference between interest and commitment, which seems to be the difference between the 2004 and the 2015 standards. So when you're interested in doing something, you do it when it's convenient. When you're committed to doing something, you accept no excuses and only results. And I kind of see that as the direction that the standard moved over time. All right, next slide. Okay, so 5.3 talks about organizational roles, responsibilities, and authorities. And this is more of those things that top management has to do that previously were assigned to the organization. So top management shall ensure those responsibilities, authorities for relevant roles are assigned and communicated within the organization. So this used to be called just roles and responsibilities, and it's not new to the standard. So, but you do need to include anything that really touches your EMS. So your internal auditor should be listed within this roles and responsibilities. Whoever is going to be responsible for this next piece, that top management shall assign the responsibility and authority for ensuring the EMS conforms to the standard and also reporting on that performance to top management. So those 2 pieces should be included in your roles and responsibilities. And again, this is something that is easily incorporated into a manual if that's what you're doing, or it could be put into a memo. Any kind of way that top management can make sure that this is established and everyone knows who's responsible for what. It's also a good place to put in those 9 responsibilities for your top management. You know, what are they required to do? That example that Marcia gave listing out the different responsibilities goes into this particular element. So, all right, that's the end of what we were going to talk about today. You can go to the next slide. Does anyone have any questions about anything that we talked about today?
Well, Angela, Michael just came up one in the question box. How often should a management commitment be updated? And if there are a required, is there a required time frame for recommitment, or is it when management changes?
So there is no established time frame within the standard itself. If you have an existing EMS, make sure that you haven't defined a specific time frame. So if you say you're going to look at it every year, then you need to make sure you're looking at it every year. Remember that the EMS is about meeting the standard, but it's also about meeting the requirements that you have set for yourself. And we'll talk about this a lot when we get to internal auditing, because you're auditing both of those requirements. So what the standard says specifically, and then what you have said you'll do to meet the standard. We've seen folks do it a lot of different ways. Some of them will review it every time they have management review, because you have to set management review on a, you prescribe how often you have management review. We've seen people do them. Yeah, periodic or an established
planned
time
intervals,
frame.
I think is what the standard says.
Planned intervals, all of those different words. They don't say, you have to do it annually. That tends to be what people look for, that it happens at least annually. But if you define it differently, and you can still show that you're making continual improvement, then that's fine. I mean, you can look at it every 2 years, every 3 years. I don't suggest that. I mean, I'm of the opinion that you should be looking at it at least annually. But I mean, if your facility is one that doesn't change that much, maybe you don't need to. We have folks that look at it or do a re-signature of their policy or review, and then sign it again every time there's a change in management. So that is a possibility. It really depends on how you write it into your own system. So I know that was a very wordy answer for something that you thought was going to be a yes or no, but
Lisa, thank you. We have a couple more. This is from Elizabeth. Do you have any examples of policy statements or parts thereof? Policy is sort of a broadly encompassing word, at least in my mind.
There are some examples.
Do you want me to go look in the ESI? It might pop on my screen though.
There are some examples if you look at our module 1, and then you'll have to flip through.
Everybody just bear with us if it pops up onto the screen.
I'm
not sure which of my two screens it's gonna. Oh, now you have to wait for my computer.
There's also an example within the design guidance workbook attachment. So while she's looking, I'll talk a little bit about that. So in the handouts, what we have is a design guidance workbook that Marcia and I and a former employee, when this standard first came out, the three of us kind of divvied up all of the elements, and basically wrote this workbook that if you're establishing an EMS, you can go through and do a bunch of different steps. And actually, by the time you're finished with this workbook, have at least the paperwork version of an EMS established. So we have some examples within there. We have some forms within there. So feel free to take a look at that. It goes into some depth on a bunch of things. But there is at least one example of an EMS in there. It doesn't have to be complicated. It can be really simple and just hit those 3 requirements, and have those necessary pieces that are spelled out within the policy element 5.2. But I have seen it be extremely wordy and pages long. It makes it really hard because remember, it has to be communicated within the organization. It can be audited. So when we go around and do our functional equivalent visits, we'll ask folks out on the floor if the facility has a policy and what it means, and can they tell us what the basic elements are within the policy, because we know it can be wordy. And a lot of our members will come up with mnemonic devices, so that I think the zoo's mnemonic device is green. And so each one of those letters kind of hits part of that, those 3 commitments. So, have any luck, Marcia?
So I am in module 1. Do you remember where it is? Is
It
it
would
in the
be,
presentation or is it an example?
oh, it would be in the presentation.
Okay. All right. So hold on.
Here's a quick one while y'all are looking.
Yep.
Well, let's see, where did it go? Oh, it disappeared. Never mind. I want to say where it was, are the slides available within the handouts? I want to
Oh, yes,
say,
Don, I answered that.
oh, did you?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's
That's
why
why
it
it
disappeared.
disappeared.
All right,
They
thanks,
are
Don.
All
there.
right.
Yeah, so one of the
Leadership.
handouts are the slides for today. We will also be posting the recording of this, as well as the slides and all of the documents that are in the handouts online once we're done going through all of the different
Okay.
sessions. And we can also send those link out to that once they're posted to everybody who's registered.
Yeah, and this will give folks, I mentioned at the beginning, we are going to be changing out those documents. So while I'm looking for this, if you want to download anything, I'm going backwards because I don't see it in policy. Why don't I see it? Policies
know.
do we do it in module 2 instead of
Maybe.
module 1? Okay.
Maybe. Sorry. A little
Sorry,
sausage
folks.
making here.
That's right.
Any other questions while she's looking for that?
Oh, yeah, we've got several. Let's see. The next is, what is a good way to bring EMS results to the overall agency's goals? Meaning, showing results adds to programmatic commitments or goals.
So that sounds like internal communication. So there are lots of ways that you can communicate your progress towards goals to the employees. You can do that through emails or newsletters. You can have bulletin boards. You can have, if you have an all hands meeting already, then you can have management speak to that, or have whoever's in charge of your EMS speak to that at those meetings. You can have charts posted in those areas where it makes sense to show progress via a chart of some kind. So there are lots and lots of ways that you can communicate your progress on goals. If you're talking about presenting them to management, then I would.
Oh, we've hit a.
Having a conversation with you.
So
Could
Angela,
you,
yeah,
that last sentence, Angela. Yeah.
we may have hit a
I don't know.
internet connectivity issue. Sorry, guys.
So,
Sorry.
um,
I'm so sorry. I have horrible internet. I'll be in the office for the next ones.
Yes. So Angela, I've got module 2 up, and we have the example to the slide where it says policy for the zoo. So are you guys seeing that?
yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I think you spoke to that one, but that tells you exactly what green stands for.
Yep. So you can see that the policy doesn't have to use the exact words that are in the commitment requirements either, as long as it means what those requirements are. So you've got the continued improvement, you've got the compliance with environmental laws and regulations, but the REE kind of hits the other pieces. You know, it means that they're protecting the environment and including pollution prevention and doing those other things that they have committed to. So as long as you can show that it means the same thing, then your policy doesn't have to use the exact wording either. So that's a question that comes up sometimes.
Yeah, and the zoo is certified by a third-party auditor.
They are.
Okay, there's your next example.
Yeah, so you can see that this one gets a little wordier, but it does still have those 3 commitments in it. And then I think it's even a different one that's in the design guidance manual.
Okay.
So,
All right.
so those are
we
just
had
a couple of
2 in the
examples.
training.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay.
From Heidi, since policies are public, you can look at policies from similar companies and pull elements from them. Guess that's
Absolutely.
a true statement.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and that's actually a really good way to benchmark. Most companies that have policies established have them on their website, and so it's very public information and easy to come about without even having to necessarily ask. So.
Okay. Let me go back to one. One of the prior ones was from Joyce. Joyce chimes in again. For industry, is it tied to SDGs and or added to sustainability reports?
Are we
SDGs are
talking about?
Sustainable Development Goals.
Are we
And
talking about the policy? Yes, thank you, Scott. Scott is
Yeah,
our resident person who just came from industry.
Acronym person.
Yeah, I believe Joyce is one asked about the policy earlier. So.
Okay, it can be. It does not have to be. Is the answer to your question.
Okay. How much information of the EMS must be available to all interested parties besides policy and goals?
Just policy and goals.
That's it.
If now that being said, we'll get to communication later. But when we talk about communication, you actually define those things that you're going to communicate on and when you're going to communicate on them and how you're going to communicate. So some of those communications also include like regulatory reports. And so while those may not be public information, they are still being provided to some interested parties. So you would be providing those regulatory reports to the agency that requires them and that kind of thing. So all of that will go into your communication plan. So just make sure that if you have a communication plan that you're meeting the requirements that you put on yourself. But as far as the standards concerned, the only 2 things that you have to make available to all interested parties are your scope and your policy.
Right. And then Angela will speak to this later. There's a piece in emergency preparedness that pulls in interested parties.
Right. But those are all very specific to individual interested parties. So, you know, it kind of makes sense. You know, you basically do what you say you're going to do, as with all management standards. Say what you're going to do and then do what you say.
Okay. And from Julia, she has a comment. At my last location, the last external auditor told us that we were not meeting the standard because we did not use the exact wording. So, yeah.
So we,
So,
I was
go
going to
ahead,
say,
Marshall.
we get asked a lot in our training by our members, you know, my auditor said this or my auditor said that, and we'll have the conversation of, this is exactly what the standard says. You can choose to push back against your auditor, but the whole entire time I've been in EMS, you know, we had a mnemonic that we used at our facility in New York, and no one's from our registrar ever said it had to be exactly the same. So I would say that should be something you push back against.
She added an example. For example, we were lacking the exact phrase prevention of pollution. So, yeah.
Yeah, we've recommended, you know, as an OFI, but not as a finding to folks to just change that wording as a clarification. But again, if it's meeting the intent, it shouldn't be an issue. We have also run into some of our members who are third-party certified having issues with extremely picky auditors. The options there are to either just do what they say or change auditors or request a different auditor but keep the same company. Sometimes, you know, the companies aren't aware of some of the issues that are caused by auditors that are a little too literal. Because the whole ISO standard, you know, it tells you what to do. It doesn't tell you how to do it. It's completely up to you how you actually go about meeting these shall statements. But yeah,
Yeah.
we've heard issues like that before. We actually have 2 members within our program that have chosen to let their certification go due to nitpicky auditors, which is part of the reason why we're doing FEs with them annually, just to help them. They wanted to keep their system. They thought it was a good system, but they wanted some oversight, and didn't feel like they were getting their money's worth out of their auditor. So it happens.
Yeah, Julia, it's a thank you, and I agree. Some auditors are more picky than others. And majority of my experience with the department is through the regulatory side. Some inspectors are more picky than others. It just depends, and you just have to roll with it and learn from it, and try to cover all bases. So.
Yep. Exactly.
Choose your
Um,
battles.
yeah.
Know your options too.
Yeah.
For anything
Okay,
else?
I think that's all of them.
Okay.
Yeah. And we
All
have a
right.
lot of thank yous for the webinar. Michelle even said thank you for breaking it up into
You're welcome.
the half-day classes. She couldn't imagine doing this in, say, 2 days or many days in a row. So,
Yeah, it gets
but we got
long.
quite a few thank yous for the format. So, and thank you,
You're welcome.
everybody.
Yeah, we when we developed this originally, it was it is 2 full days in class, because once we get you away from your offices, it's easier. But we understand, you know, sitting in front of a monitor for 2 full days would drive just about anybody nuts. So understood.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right.
So, Don, if
I
we
think we
don't,
got one
oh, go ahead.
more. Just came through. This is from Joyce. Yeah. Yes. Just wondering if EMS served as a basis for business sustainability report. I know the DFW International Airport uses it in this way.
Hmm.
It
Sorry,
can.
Don. He was
I
responding to
haven't.
me. I was just
You know.
chatting
Oh,
with her privately.
okay.
Oh, okay. I was just, it could. I haven't seen it that way, but it could.
Mhm.
And I think that's it. So we had a lot of thank yous, and we really do appreciate it. A lot of people saying they're really enjoying the casual conversation, and that's how we usually present this. It's a give and take. We learn from each other. So.
Absolutely. And again, this will all be posted online once we've had time to, you know, we edit off the first half hour where we're sitting around talking to each other and you guys don't hear us. So it takes a little bit for our magicians in the background to do that, but it should be out in the next, you know, after the last one is done, it should be within a week or so of that. So, alrighty. Well, thank you all. If there aren't any more questions, we'll let you go, give you back a half hour of your day,
Yeah.
and we'll be
See
talking
y'all
to you
next
next
Thursday.
Thursday. And we're sorry about the GMT timing. If anybody noticed that in the reminder, it's weird artifact of GoToWebinar when you schedule like 4 things at a time, or you know, whatever, multiple days at a time. It converts everything to GMT and we can't figure out how to change it. So we apologize. It's always going to be at 1 in the afternoon for Eastern time. You guys can figure that out for wherever you are in the country. So, all right. Thank you all.
And then if you have any questions between now and when we see you again next Thursday, shoot us some emails. But otherwise,
You
we
should,
look forward to chatting with y'all
yeah.
again.
Yeah, you should all have my email at the very least in your reminders.
Yep.
So, all right. Thank you.
Okay, everybody, have a great afternoon.
Take care.